We are on week 4, which is a little unbelievable. Time really flies when you are learning so many things about the Arctic. So today, we have 2 amazing speakers. We are going to be learning about cultural heritage in the first hour, and then wildlife management and biology conservation in the second hour. And as a reminder, we'll have 2 more synchronized sessions after this because of our bump from one of our earlier speakers who couldn't make it. So we'll have 2 more speakers next week. And then the following week, we'll have Dr. Beth Ferris come back and visit us. And then we'll have kind of an hour of discussion, breakout rooms, where we go next, because whether you like me or not, you are stuck with me even after this synchronized Tuesday version of the Arctic College finishes and we move into building our network and hopefully some good friendships with the folks in our college. All right, I think that is enough from me. Instead of hearing more from me, which I'm sure you are already tired of, I'm going to instead hand my virtual mic over to my colleague and friend, Emily Tsui. And Emily is currently a visiting fellow at the Arctic Institute, and she has done some fantastic work on Arctic cultural heritage. After this session, I will share a webinar that Emily ran a couple of months ago, which was a really spectacular panel bringing together Indigenous knowledge holders, archaeologists, heritage professionals about cultural heritage in the Arctic and climate change, which was a pretty great event. As usual, if you have questions throughout Emily's presentation, please put them in the chat and I'll be messaging you to ask if you'd like to come on and ask them or if you'd like me to read them out loud. Okay, that is enough from me. I am going to hand over my mic now to you, Emily.
Thank you, Victoria. It's very nice to be here. Thank you all for being here today and for agreeing to listen to me present about cultural heritage and international law in the Arctic. A little bit about me. I am a graduating student at the University of Toronto in Canada at the Faculty of Law and the Monk School of Global Affairs, where I did a Juris Doctor and a Master's of Global Affairs there. My personal interest in cultural heritage in the Arctic is that I'm a very big fan of UNESCO sites. Very briefly, my partner and I was the unofficial world record holders for most UNESCO sites visited in 24 hours. It was a lot of fun. We went to Belgium and the Netherlands on train and public transport, and we ran all over the place. We took some pictures. But even though having all this documentation, Guinness said that was not enough. They required a bit more. So unfortunately, we couldn't be officially certified. But that was briefly it. Since then, the record has been long broken. But that's my personal interest. I also really like scuba diving. So I have my advanced open water divers. And so you'll see today that there is a bit of emphasis on shipwrecks. And so that comes from a personal interest of mine with scuba diving. So with that being said, I think I'll get started with the presentation. So I'll just share my screen. Can you all see the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay, perfect. Great, so today I will talk about cultural heritage in the Arctic and specifically what international law has to say about it and how it is governed. So today I'll talk about briefly cultural heritage in the Arctic, some contemporary issues, and then in part 2 I'll talk about international law in the Arctic. And so very important to note, I don't really go into legal analysis in this presentation. Hopefully I get to more of the larger themes in international law, so it's not required that you have a law background at all. I will try to explain the important parts that are relevant. I'll talk specifically about shipwrecks in the Arctic as part of the cultural heritage in the Arctic, and then I'll wrap up and have and there'll be an opportunity for questions. So cultural heritage in the Arctic. What is cultural heritage when we talk about cultural heritage? Generally, cultural heritage refers to things with a human connection that come from our ancestors. And this is a very broad classification, and the UNESCO definition of cultural heritage is interesting because it is outlined in a set of, I guess, dichotomies. So they say that cultural heritage includes things that are both tangible and intangible. So we think the Eiffel Tower. We also think of oral histories and epic poetry. Cultural heritage includes things that are movable or not movable. So think sculptures or archaeological sites. It includes man-made objects or natural objects. So the Struve geodetic arc, which is the first attempt at calculating the meridian line. So it's a set of monuments located in Norway, Finland, Russia, and other countries. And there's natural heritage sites, such as the Nahanini National Park. So when we talk about natural sites, we generally talk about those in a distinct category from cultural heritage. But cultural heritage and natural sites, of course, are interlinked, and UNESCO does recognize that through a separate category of mixed sites, but natural sites are very important to cultural heritage. There's also land-based cultural heritage, such as the Pudorana Plateau in Russia, which is a very diverse ecosystem. The park there has the largest, I think, reindeer herd in the world at the time that it was designated a World Heritage Site. There's also submerged cultural heritage, such as the two famous Canadian shipwrecks, HMS Airbus and Terror. I'll talk a little bit more about those in case you're not Canadian and you aren't aware of the fandom associated with Airbus and Terror. Not to worry, we'll get into that. So cultural heritage can fall into a lot of different categories, and there really is no perfect fit, and that there's a very diverse classification of that. So if you are listening and if you'd like to put in the chat some examples of cultural heritage in your own country, I'd really like to see that. And maybe if you want to participate in the exercise of classifying what kind of cultural heritage is it? Is it tangible? Is it movable? Is it man-made, natural? Is it land-based or submerged? I think it'd be pretty interesting just to see where everyone is from and the fun things that we could see if we visited your country in the future. And so when we talk about the legal regime about cultural heritage, some considerations to take into account are the origins of the cultural heritage. Is the cultural heritage, does it come from Indigenous peoples? Does it come from settler groups? Does it have a colonial origin? What are the origins of cultural heritage? And that is related in terms of how it is interpreted and how it is protected and managed, partially because of museum bias or partially because of other things. The age of the object of cultural heritage is relevant from a legal standpoint, which I'll talk about later. The object can be from 50 years old, it can be 100 years old, it can come from a really long time ago, time immemorial. The location of the cultural heritage really matters from a legal standpoint. Is it on Indigenous territory, national boundaries, multiple countries? Is it the common heritage of mankind? Most laws apply territorially, so knowing where the cultural heritage is located is relevant to knowing where the law, which kind of laws apply. And in terms of recognizing cultural heritage, who recognizes it is also important. Is it UNESCO, the World Heritage Committee, that recognizes it as a World Heritage Site? Is it a national authority that recognizes it, or is it civil society? Is it other groups? So cultural heritage means a lot of different things to a lot of different groups, and that's part of the complexities associated when we are talking about international legal regimes. And of course, as well, the definition of cultural heritage changes over time as understandings of societal norms shift as well, and understandings of what is important to cultures change. And so I'd like to just provide some examples of cultural heritage in the Arctic to contextualize this a bit. One of the most famous is UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They are well known, and countries really vie for designation for World Heritage Sites. And part of the reason why they do that is that, there's increased prestige associated with a site that is called World Heritage, but they also have an obligation once a site is designated as a World Heritage Site. The 1972 UNESCO Convention that establishes this whole system of World Heritage Sites obligates countries to do all it can to ensure the protection of the site. This convention also provides a system of funding. So for developing countries that cannot necessarily afford to protect the cultural heritage sites, this convention creates a system of funding that would allow for these sites to be protected when they otherwise wouldn't. They also have provide for knowledge sharing, as it creates a system of periodic reporting between states, allowing other experts to publicly review the reports, and of course to contact the states directly if they have any grand ideas on how to protect these sites. And of course, I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, from a more personal note, World Heritage Site is associated with increased tourism, which is great in terms of revenues for the local communities and for increasing prosperity for the region. Of course, any kind of tourism must be carefully managed, especially in sensitive regions such as the Arctic. And so there are about 1,100 properties right now inscribed on the World Heritage List. This list changes every year. There are more lists. Very rarely are properties removed. I don't actually think that properties have been removed, or I think only 2 of them have. But in any case, there are more that are added every year as the committee considers new requests by countries to put on more properties on the list. In the Arctic region, there are few. So even though the Arctic region comprises of 10% of the world's landmass and 4 million people live there, there are only 16 sites north of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program area, which is broader than that 10% that I mentioned. And there are 8 natural sites, 7 cultural sites, and 1 mixed site. Wrangel Island is located in Russia, is the only UNESCO site listed for its marine values. So we all know that the Arctic is a region with an ocean at the center, but only one of these sites deals with its marine values. And this is a gap that UNESCO noted themselves. So in 2017, they launched this World Heritage in the Arctic program that really tried to re-emphasize UNESCO's role in the region. And they identified 7 potential marine sites in the Arctic for consideration on the World Heritage List. So that hasn't changed since 2017. They haven't been included, but that is something to look forward to in the future. So aside from World Heritage Sites, we also have intangible cultural heritage in the Arctic. So UNESCO defines intangible cultural heritage as practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants. So this is very broad. And this system of intangible cultural heritage is governed by this international convention called the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. There are numerous states parties to it, but it is important to note that Canada is not a party to it. United States and Russia, they are not parties to it. The only parties to it are Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden in the Arctic region. But that doesn't stop the listing of intangible cultural heritage onto this list, even though a state is not a party to it. So there are 584 items listed for 131 countries. And in the Arctic, there's only 1 intangible cultural heritage that's inscribed on this list. And that's the Yakut heroic epics in Russia. And these epics are really, really something. So I would encourage any of you who is interested to go on UNESCO's Intangible Heritage site and listen to a few, because these poems go from 10 verses to 15,000 verses, and they're really incredible and a really good expression of the practices inherited from ancestors. So that's the only one that's inscribed, but of course, informally, on an informal basis, there should be a lot more that is considered intangible cultural heritage. And so now the focus of this presentation will be shipwrecks. So briefly, underwater cultural heritage in the Arctic includes more than just shipwrecks. They include objects of an archaeological, historical, cultural nature that are located partially or fully underwater. And so in practice, this, of course, includes a lot of old shipwrecks, but also includes fish traps, submerged buildings, and other artifacts. North of the Arctic Circle, There are about 750 known shipwrecks. And in the larger AMAP area, there's about 2,400 known shipwrecks, but not all these shipwrecks would fall under the definition of underwater cultural heritage. There are just a lot of shipwrecks. So there's a mix of whaling ships, survey vessels, fishing boats, cargo ships, submarines, and more, which all identify a different part of human history and human interaction in the Arctic. The famous shipwrecks, as I mentioned before, are Airbus and Terror, and also HMS Investigator, which went to look for HMS Airbus and Terror, but then sank. So what are some contemporary issues in protection and management that international law relates to? So there are some serious and potential challenges posed related to funding. So because of COVID, as we all know, museums have been shut down. Funding for cultural heritage institutions has been relegated to a very low priority on lots of countries' lists, including Canada's, which focus more on responding to the immediate health crisis. And that is a pretty big problem when we talk about managing a cultural heritage. There's also a concern about how to present the history of cultural heritage and to ensure that this history is not biased. And thankfully, the conversation is improving in terms of incorporating and really involving Indigenous peoples in having their history presented on their cultural heritage, as opposed to having, let's say, a Southern institution present the history for them. But this is still a challenge when we talk about how to manage cultural heritage. And there's also big issues of climate change, where climate change does impact the structural integrity of cultural heritage, and it impacts the accessibility of it as well. Other challenges include illicit trafficking, increased tourism, increased accessibility, where unmanaged human activity threaten the very existence of cultural heritage sites. But that being said, it is also an opportunity, which I'll mention in a second. So less likely in the Arctic, some issues are armed conflicts. So a few years ago in Mali, UNESCO World Heritage Site was destroyed by the warring parties there. So in the Arctic, the threat of an armed conflict to destroy cultural heritage is, I'd say, almost next to none. So that is an issue under international law that has been very heavily regulated, is the protection of cultural heritage in times of armed conflict, but don't really have a direct application to the Arctic region. Other opportunities today is that there are greater respect for Indigenous traditional knowledge, which is excellent in terms of really understanding the history and the importance of cultural heritage. Other opportunities are posed by technology and digitization. So with technology, boats can go further, they can map better, so they can better understand the seabed, which of course helped to discover Airbus and Terror. But also digitization allows for, I guess, increased sustainability of tourism, where tourists don't actually need to go to the area, but can appreciate the objects and the artifacts nonetheless. And that's very important, because one of the main purposes of cultural heritage protection and management is to ensure that the public has access to them. And that's what digitization provides. So now I'd like to move on to international law and cultural heritage. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I understand that you come from a very diverse group and you may not have had a crash course in international law, which is perfectly fine. So when we talk about what is international law really consists of four main things. The first is international conventions. So that's what we normally think about international law, are these treaties. Second, we think about customary international law, which is essentially what is accepted by a lot of states, as seen in both an expression of their belief, but also state practice. We also use general principles of law, which are derived from common legal practices of a lot of nations. We don't know how many nations, that hasn't really been clarified by courts, but the general standard is that a lot of nations. And finally, case law. So cases of the ICJ are highly the International Court of Justice is highly persuasive and also teachings of and writings of scholars, which we don't really see in domestic law, in the common law system at least, but at the international law, scholars do play a very important role in shaping the landscape, and they do constitute a part of international law. And so why focus on international law? Because I could have taken this presentation in the direction of national law, in the direction of subnational law, but why focus on international law? I think international law is really interesting. It deals with relations between states. It focuses significantly on developing norms for these relations between states. And I like it because it's quite aspirational in a sense, in that it guides states to essentially do better in many areas. So the environment, it guides states to do better in terms of making sure that there is no spiral towards complete anarchy. International law does create this system that's there. And I think when we talk about cultural heritage, we talk about cultural heritage of a group, but we also talk about cultural heritage as it relates to all of humankind. And so that's why I think international law is quite relevant when we talk about cultural heritage at an international sense and also at a transboundary sense. And very briefly, this question comes up a lot. Is international law effective? It's important to separate effectiveness from enforcement. We all know that there's no global police force, but in any sense, international law is effective in the sense of that there has been no war since World War II. Relations between states are generally pretty stable. States do adhere to their international obligations virtually all the time, except, of course, we are familiar with the very high publicized examples of breaches of international law. But in general, international law is quite effective at achieving these objectives. And in international law, since the post-war era, so since 1945, there has been this long observed phenomenon where separate legal norms and institutions develop independently from each other. And this concern is called fragmentation. And this concern arises from the fact that there are so many international laws on so many topics. The question is what is the effect of all of these differences, what it has on the international legal system as a whole. And the other opposing phenomenon that we see is this phenomenon called constitutionalization. And this deals with the idea that despite all these different aspects of international law, so we have international environmental law in one corner, we have human rights law in another corner, we have cultural heritage law, we have law of the sea, we have all these different areas of law. But nonetheless, there are still some unifying principles and instruments in international law that brings everything together, kind of like a global constitution. So when we talk about international law, it has to deal with these two effects, and these two effects really play out in cultural heritage law that we see in the Arctic region. And so cultural heritage law interacts with a ton of different areas too, like it's not its own separate branch of law. Exclusively, it deals with environmental law, it deals with human rights law, it deals with the law of armed conflict, and it also operates under the rules of treaty interpretation and state responsibility that all tie cultural heritage law together. And briefly, one of the things that we talk about in fragmentation and constitutionalization is this idea of regionalism in international law. And frequently when we talk about international law in the Arctic, what comes up almost all the time is the 3 legally binding agreements that are negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council. And this is the Search and Rescue Agreement. This is the agreement on prevention of oil spills and pollution in the Arctic, and the most recent Science Agreement. And these are 3 agreements that are legally binding, intending to treat the Arctic as a distinct region in international law. So we see there is a trend towards this, though, this stopped in 2017. We haven't seen a new legally binding agreement since 2017 with the Science Agreement. Okay, so how does cultural heritage fit in this international law? So briefly, I'd classified this as international laws that directly fit as it relates to cultural heritage, but also international law that indirectly relates to the protection of cultural heritage. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And And cultural heritage is protected and managed not only by international law, but national laws, subnational laws, indigenous customs, and not even law at all, but just policy documents that guide academics and states' behavior. But if you are interested in international cultural heritage law at large, this book by Janet Blake provides an excellent, excellent introduction to this whole field of international cultural heritage law as a distinct field and how this field overlaps with other fields in public international law. I think I'd like to turn our attention now to shipwrecks. So what we see on the screen here is HMS Airbus. So what happened was that in the early 19th century, the British government were really eager to embark on their search for this fabled Northwest Passage that will link Europe to Asia through the Arctic region. And after some half-hearted attempts, they decided to send these two ships, Airbus and Terror, through the region. And as we all know, the ships disappeared and were not to be found for the next, I think, about 170, 180 years. And these ships were really famous in England at the time. They had celebrity status because these ships explored both the Antarctic and the Arctic, and they were led by a pretty famous person in England, Sir John Franklin. And the idea of exploration was really picking up in the early 19th century. And so the disappearance of the ships really caused the British public to think about whether or not and how they wanted to engage in exploration missions worldwide. For Canada, after its independence, it took a particular importance of finding these ships because it would help in the Canadian government's eyes to assert its claims to sovereignty in the region. So these are two ships, and there's a really great book on this by a former member of the Monty Python troupe, Mike Palin, called Erebus, and it's a really entertaining account of this ship. But this ship was eventually found in 2014 with the help of the Inuit. I mean, the Inuit knew where these ships were the whole time since it sank because they saw these white people from England get off this boat and looking very dazed, and they had told people who were looking for these ships that they were located where they were eventually found, or in the rough direction, but they just their knowledge was not respected back then, and now we really see this is a great example as to why it is so important to really listen and to really involve Indigenous peoples at every step of cultural heritage research. So I mentioned earlier that not all shipwrecks are considered cultural heritage. So here is a graphical illustration of this. So shipwrecks in the Arctic, HMS Airbus and Terror, are two very famous exceptions, but there are a lot of ships in the Arctic, and they largely mark a history of human tragedy globally in the Arctic. So when we see when most shipwrecks came into effect, or when they happened, the whaling disaster of 1871, World War I, World War II, and the 1964 Alaska earthquake. So these large global incidents caused most of the shipwrecks in the Arctic today. And so historically, all these shipwrecks were really well preserved due to cold water. So cold water actually really preserved shipwrecks well. And the shipwrecks were just not really accessible. I mean, they were located in the Arctic. It's very cold water. No one really is that interested in going there. So a lot of the Arctic shipwrecks are spared from the challenges that shipwrecks in the South would face. So in the Caribbean and off the coast of Spain, a lot of the shipwrecks are looted. A lot of tourists go there and don't really respect the scuba diving guidelines about how you interact with wrecks. So shipwrecks in the Arctic really have this opportunity right now to be very well preserved and to be accounted for. And this is driven by technological developments, which make it a lot easier to research and visit the shipwrecks. And one recent example of this is the case of American multimillionaire Victor Vescovo, who reached the deepest point of all oceans, including the Arctic Ocean, by himself, just independently. He financed the whole thing, including the submarine that you see on the bottom left corner. This is a big advancement for humankind because it really shows the potential of technology to do research in these remote areas, but it is something to pay attention to. There are other current threats. So ocean acidification really changes the composition of the shipwrecks and the metals, and it increases deterioration of the integrity of the shipwrecks. Changes in water levels will cause some ships to be more inaccessible and other ships to be more accessible, depending on if the water level increases or falls. And tourism, like I mentioned, unconstrained tourism without guidelines means that there's a potential for destruction of valuable underwater cultural heritage sites. So under international law, where does all of this fit in? So like I said, there are 4 sources of international law. So going through them pretty quickly because they're not that important for the purpose of this presentation, to go through them in depth, I mean. So international conventions include, most notably, the Law of the Sea Convention. So there are only 2 provisions in this Law of the Sea Convention that deal with the protection of underwater cultural heritage, but they're still widely influential because they're seen as reflective of customary international law. And then there is the very important 2001 Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention. None of the Arctic states are party to this convention, but as I will explain later, it's still a very important convention when it applies to the Arctic. There are some regional conventions as well, most notably the 1892 convention dealing with underwater cultural heritage in Europe. No equivalent regime exists in the Arctic. There's also a bilateral convention, so the 1997 MOU between the UK and Canada relating to the eventual discovery of Airbus and Terror. So Airbus and Terror were not discovered yet back in 1997, but this MOU creates a framework as to how the state should behave once the shipwrecks would be eventually discovered. And moving on, customary international law does relate to how shipwrecks in the Arctic are governed. So not really so much in the Arctic, but in cases of armed conflict, each party to the conflict is prohibited from destroying historic monuments, especially in like shipwrecks. There's also general principles of law that relate. So international cooperation is very important to the protection of cultural heritage. And finally, there are the teachings of highly qualified publicists, and I suggest that you check out this excellent book by Sarah Dromgoole, Underwater Cultural Heritage and International Law, which is really the textbook on the subject. And it does have application to the Arctic, of course, because we're talking about cultural heritage. And like I said, we can also alternatively distinguish these conventions on how it relates to the art and cultural heritage. So for example, the 1970 convention deals with illicit trafficking, specifically on cultural heritage and cultural property. The 1972 UNESCO Convention specifically deals with cultural and natural heritage. It's in its title, but that's not it. It's not sufficient to stop there. There's also international laws that, that cover largely another topic of international law, but also cover cultural heritage protection tangentially or in a couple of the provisions. So the Convention of the Law of the Sea is a good example of this. It is the Constitution of the Oceans. It has hundreds of articles in its provisions. It's not ostensibly related to cultural heritage just as its object, but there are the 2 important provisions related to cultural heritage. Another indirect instrument is this Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. In this convention, it obligates states and ships to, when planning its course, to avoid sensitive cultural heritage sites. And by avoiding sensitive cultural heritage sites, there's a thought that there wouldn't be any unnecessary pollution that harms the object below. And finally, there's things like this 2017 Arctic Science Agreement that was negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, which relates to scientific cooperation, but underwater cultural heritage benefits from that in terms of encouraging scientists to share the information, encouraging states to, or obligating states to ensure that access is facilitated for researchers. So it is important when we talk about underwater cultural heritage to really take a broad view about all these different conventions, customary international law, general principles, and teachings and writings to see what exactly law applies, because this does have pretty significant impact for what kind of protection that is afforded to a shipwreck. And so exactly on this point, so different conventions, different laws have different definitions of underwater cultural heritage, which means that not all shipwrecks are covered. So the Convention of the Law of the Sea protects objects of archaeological and historical nature. The Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention from 2001 simultaneously takes a broader and a more restrictive view. So it covers not just objects, but all traces of human existence having a cultural character as well, which are partially or totally underwater, periodically or continuously, but it is restrictive in the sense that it does require that the shipwrecks be, or objects or traces be, at least 100 years old. And the 100-year-old requirement is not in the Convention of the Law of the Sea, and it differs from state to state. So in Nunavut, for example, which is not international law, but it's a good comparison, it's just 75 years to receive the protection that the archaeological regulations provide for it, cultural heritage. There's also different laws that protect underwater cultural heritage from different threats. So the Marpol Convention, which deals with ship pollution, that deals with how the transit of ships with these specific areas. Science agreement, like I mentioned, ensures cooperative behavior. It's also important when we talk about the kinds of law that protect underwater cultural heritage to look at where it's located. So depending on where the object is located, it receives the benefits of different legal regimes or not. Like I said, the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention, no Arctic states are a party to the convention, but nonetheless, it is a very persuasive agreement, but that still doesn't make it binding, but it is only binding when the parties to the agreement interact with cultural heritage in the high seas. So most of the Arctic Ocean is not in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which means that there is a lot of it's in the exclusive economic zone of a state, meaning that states do have certain rights over it. But in the areas of the high sea beyond exclusive economic zones, this Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention would apply to states party to it, which is none of the Arctic states. And so when you look at the combination of these different laws, we see a number of existing gaps that exist. So not all shipwrecks are covered. So we have the 2,400 ships in the AMAP area, but a small percentage of them would be covered under different definitions of UCH. Only certain threats to shipwrecks are addressed. So illicit trafficking would be addressed, but climate change threats wouldn't really be addressed. Tourism threats wouldn't really be addressed. And not all shipwrecks everywhere would be covered to the same extent of protection overall. So looking briefly at one specific type of protection pertains to Airbus and Terra, which are governed by this series of bilateral agreements. You don't really need to know too much about them for the purpose of this presentation, but it is helpful to know that there are three that deal with before the discovery of Airbus and Terra, and then after the discovery of Airbus and Terra, that governs the relations between Canada and the United Kingdom on what to deal with this very important piece of cultural heritage of both states. HMS Airbus and Terra are governed also by domestic law, so it has received National Historic Site designation, means that there must be prior authorization before human activity occurs. And the Nunavut Agreement establishes conservation areas for the sites. And so I keep mentioning the fact that because none of the Arctic states are party to the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention, it doesn't really matter. And the reason why it doesn't really matter is because it's not sufficient when we look at cultural heritage protection to focus exclusively on international law and exclusively on laws at all. And so that's because the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention reflects this other document, this 1996 Charter on the Protection and Management of Underwater Cultural Heritage. And this charter was created by the International Council on Monuments and Sites on best practices and is highly, highly influential in terms of informing how researchers and scientists interact with UCH. And the charter is basically just copy and pasted with some minor edits into the annex of the convention. And because it does so, it becomes an integral part of the convention. And so they largely reflect very similar things. So even if an Arctic state is not party to the Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, this convention, it still will be informed by the practices set out in this charter. Okay, so briefly wrapping up now. So what have we covered today? So how is Arctic cultural heritage governed by international law? We see that there is a lot of different legal instruments out there, and I didn't even cover the different customary international law, general principles of law, or scholarly writings. I just really briefly touched upon international conventions. And so this raises the specter of fragmentation. But we also see there is harmony among the many legal instruments because all these legal instruments emphasize the fact that cultural heritage must be protected. There must be international cooperation. And because of the chart, we see in the charter that is a general preference towards in situ preservation, which means you leave the underwater cultural heritage in place. You don't try to bring it up. So there is, in practice, some kind of harmony among these various different instruments. We also know that there's not a region-specific regime. So unlike Europe, where they have this regional-specific convention relating to cultural heritage protection, we don't really have the same in the Arctic. And we also see that not all cultural heritage is a beneficiary of international legal regimes and different international legal protections. So now that we know how is Arctic cultural heritage governed by international law, the second question is how should Arctic cultural heritage be governed by international law? And so the first question we can ask is how unique is the Arctic environment that deserves a separate regime? Is there actually a pan-Arctic cultural heritage that deserves a separate regime? Or is it sufficient to just focus on a national sense? Is more actually needed to protect Arctic cultural heritage? Because on the one hand, you can argue that the CPUCH principles in this charter is totally sufficient to govern Arctic cultural heritage, but I would probably say it's not totally sufficient because the Arctic environment is pretty unique. I think we have this unique opportunity by the fact that it hasn't received a lot of tourists, it hasn't received a lot of research and focus in previous years. So I think more is needed to make sure that moving forward that these cultural heritage sites are protected in a very systematically planned manner. And should international law be the way that we govern and protect cultural heritage? I would probably hedge and say yes, because international law is more than just creating enforceable rules. It is about mobilizing domestic resources, setting norms, and so much more. And so one example of this is that back in 2012, Susan Barr drafted this report for the Arctic Council, the assessment of cultural heritage monuments and sites in the Arctic. It lists 30 important cultural heritage sites in the Arctic and suggested that in 5 years' time, so by 2017, there will be a review of these sites to see what will happen. Nothing has happened. Since 2017, nothing has happened at all at the Arctic Council related to these cultural heritage monuments and sites in the Arctic. And I think that engaging a discussion on a legally binding regime will mobilize resources to creating a concerted course of action to ensuring that cultural heritage is protected. But that being said, I have to say international law does have its inherent limits. It focuses on states, it excludes indigenous nations from the conversation. Of course, I know that UNDRIP is fairly recent in terms of trying to slowly rectify towards that, but international law does emphasize its primacy towards states. And because of that, cultural heritage in the Arctic maybe shouldn't be primarily governed by international legal agreement, but I would say that that is one instrument that should be used by policymakers. And so I'm going to leave you with some food for thought. I don't necessarily have the answers to these questions, but these are just some ideas to mull on for the rest of your day. So one question to consider is, to what extent is international law a useful tool for the protection of cultural heritage in the Arctic? How does this compare to other things like national laws, operational guidelines for international bodies like UNESCO, policy documents, and more? Is there really a need for a region-specific Arctic cultural heritage regime? What are the advantages and disadvantages does international law bring in the field of cultural heritage? And how distinct is cultural heritage protection in the general area of international law writ large? Or is it better to frame it in the areas of Indigenous rights or environmental protection? So that's just what I want to leave you with. So now I'm very happy to take some questions. And so Victoria, I think I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And if everyone could join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause for a whirlwind tour of cultural heritage and legal frameworks. I know I was taking a lot of notes, and I'm sure I was not the only one. We have lots of questions that have come in already, and I'm going to ask Julia, do you want to ask your question first?
Sure. First of all, thank you for the great presentation. It was super interesting. And I was just wondering, because I studied law in my bachelor, so I'm a little bit drawn by it. And so I was wondering, when shipwreck is found, for example, in international waters, who has the right to ownership for it, if you know?
That is a very good question. And that answer depends on the type of shipwreck that it is. So generally, if it's the most famous ones are state-owned shipwrecks. And so in those cases, there is sovereign immunity for those shipwrecks, which means that if it's a United Kingdom ship that sank in international waters, or anywhere actually, the UK has first right to access it. But if it's not, if it's a commercial ship that is, back then, the distinction between what is a state-owned, what is a state/commercial owned ship is kind of blurry. When you think of, let's say, the East India Company of Britain, it has pretty good state ties. So in those cases, the state that where the ship sunk. That was not a sentence, but this flag state of the ship where it sank would have a title over it. But in cases of, let's say, fishing boats, the answer is, or like random fishing boats that we really not sure where it came from. We hope that we can see a flag in it, and it would be the flag state. But other cases, and in many of the cases, we don't know, and then the answer is very ambiguous, as a lot of these things are.
Thank you.
We have another question from Madison, who would like to thank you for such an interesting presentation. And she says that she is a bit confused about how finding HMS Airbus and Terror impact Canadian sovereignty, and apologizes that she is not Canadian. But I think maybe a few words on the connection between Canadian sovereignty and HMS Airbus and Terror.
Madison, that is a very good question, and I am
it looks like Emily is slightly frozen, but hopefully her connection will come back in a moment. I know that she is geographically not in the Arctic despite her background, but is in a place with limited internet connection.
I think I'm back. Yeah. I'm not sure how much you heard, but I was basically saying I think it was such a good question to ask, Madison, because in theory it shouldn't affect Canadian sovereignty finding these two shipwrecks. But the find happened under Stephen Harper's tenure. The Conservatives were in power in Canada, and he really promoted this idea of sovereignty has to be used or lost. And part of that is that if there's more evidence of human existence, that is more evidence of Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. And this is an idea that has a very horrific history in Canada, where the Canadian government back in the 1960s would transport Indigenous or Inuit families living in southern parts of Nunavut and move them forcibly in the north to prove this idea of Canadian sovereignty, where we have to use it or lose it. And it had very disastrous consequences for the Inuit. Many of the individuals died, and the legacy of this project is that a lot of their children are still suffering today from this understandably horrific trauma. And so Canada has always seen this idea that if there's more historic evidence, then there is more sovereignty, as if sovereignty is quantifiable or is something that can be measured. And I think this is not too unique to Canada. I think China does that too in the South China Sea by trying to prove all this historic evidence as basis of sovereignty there.
Wow, so much to think, and just the surface of a much bigger issue. But that's why our discussion sessions are great, that we could talk about all of these connections between what we're learning and grander themes in the Arctic. Scout, would you like to come and ask your question on next?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. And thanks, Emily. That was a really interesting presentation, and I learned a lot. I was wondering if you could go over one more time why not all shipwrecks are considered a part of cultural heritage, because you did have that quote that the ocean is the world's largest museum. And I really liked that quote. I wrote it down, and I figured that, you know, if we could view shipwrecks, especially in the ocean, as these really well-preserved bits of history, because, you know, the water's so cold, as you were talking about, why they wouldn't be considered a part of cultural heritage.
That's a really great question, Scout. And the quote is by the French archaeologist Salomon Reinach, and I think it's great, and it captures the whole essence of underwater cultural heritage. And the reason why shipwrecks are not considered part of cultural heritage is really a legal and technical one. So I think informally you can say that shipwrecks are considered cultural heritage, but the legal definition, such as the Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, this 2001 UNESCO Convention, puts a limit to 100 years. So if a shipwreck is sunk after World War I, essentially, it's not considered underwater cultural heritage for the purpose of this convention. And for the purpose of this convention, it means that states don't have to report findings of these more recent shipwrecks. So this convention creates an obligation for the states parties that find the shipwreck to report it to the International Seabed Authority of their find, and it creates like a whole bunch of other requirements, such as how do you deal with this shipwreck that you find. But if the shipwreck is under 100 years old, there's no obligation for states to do that because it's not considered underwater cultural heritage. And so that's, I think you've hit the point exactly as to this is a huge limitation in international law, because it does create these black and white boundaries as to what is considered underwater cultural heritage or not.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question comes from Sierra, who says they were surprised by the effect of the recent fire at Tree Castle had on her. It felt like a violent assault on her Indigenous identity. What are your thoughts on the connections among climate change and cultural heritage? For instance, ocean acidification in terms of underwater cultural heritage, or increases in wildfires in the Arctic, and local Indigenous communities in that context?
That is a really good question. And I think to answer the question about the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage comes from, I think there's a number of perspectives that it's important to take. The first, I think, is to recognize that when we talk about the Canadian, Alaskan, and the Greenlandic, actually most of the Arctic region in particular, it's important to really, I think, listen to Indigenous voices who have seen the impact of climate change from a really long time, to understand what kind of connections has to occur in terms of protect cultural heritage. Because I think for the Canadian government, for example, which is pretty new at this, protecting cultural heritage compared to the Inuit caretakers and the other Indigenous groups there for a long time, there is a lot of listening that has to happen before any action takes place. But in terms of the kind of actions that should take place, It's that the connection between cultural heritage is that cultural heritage will be, I think, mostly negatively impacted by climate change. Ocean acidification will destroy shipwrecks. And the problem is that the main principle in archaeology is that for shipwrecks is to leave the shipwrecks as they are. So it's in situ preservation. We don't want to disturb it, because if we disturb it, we are going to damage the structural integrity of these ships. And so we leave it there. But if we leave it there, then it's going to be a victim of ocean acidification. So there is this dichotomy as to what exactly we should do. And I am not an archaeologist, so I'm not sure what the best solution is. But when we talk about how law can play a role to it, it's really creating this better interface between law, science, and policy, and making sure that these three different disciplines listen really well to each other to ensure that the negative effects of climate change are abated as much as possible in terms of how it affects cultural heritage. But that being said, I think climate change does create a big opportunity in terms of making cultural heritage a lot more accessible to people who haven't had access to it in the past. And cultural heritage should be, and I think must be, shared globally to a wider audience. And I think that's why I think that's a benefit of climate change in doing so.
Yeah, some really interesting connections between climate change and cultural heritage. And I think that intersection is only growing, both in terms of opportunities and in thinking hard about what it means to adapt sites or to document loss of sites. We have another question. We have two more questions, and then we will switch over to our second speaker. So Kalia says that it's been reported that over 5,000 archaeological and historical sites in Labrador will be lost due to climate change over the next few years. Do you see any effort in the international heritage community to address climate change or push mitigation from a heritage perspective?
Yes, I do, but I'm going to actually not answer this part of the question and let Victoria answer that later on, because Victoria really knows much more about how the international heritage community is trying to address climate change's impact on cultural heritage. But from a legal standpoint, I think that is lagging a lot more than what heritage professionals are doing. I think that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. First, among policymakers to turn their attention to it. And once they've turned their attention to it, to demand that lawyers get involved and work in terms of creating a legal agreement or revising existing legal agreements to deal with climate change. But I suggest you connect with Victoria to learn a lot more about this.
Yeah, and maybe just a word before we hand it to Dimitris for our final question. The cultural heritage community is more actively engaging in the climate change community over the past few years. And this is both within the UN framework for climate change. So there's been a working group established and hopefully a special report on cultural heritage and climate change that the IPCC is currently working on. And that will hopefully lead to more coordination around UN Conference of Parties. So the big negotiations that happen with international climate treaties to have cultural heritage more integrated into that work. And on the practitioner side, there's also increasing connections on both adaptation of sites. So how vulnerable and exposed are sites to climate hazards, and making sure every site has the capacity to assess where their vulnerabilities are so they can make the most informed decisions on what to try to save, but also seeing cultural heritage, particularly historic buildings, as part of climate mitigation, because the greenest building is the one that's already built. So that is my spiel of climate change and cultural heritage from the non-legal side. I am going to hand it to Dimitris for our final question before we finish up with cultural heritage and move to the natural world for our second speaker.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Emily, for a great presentation. And my question also is related to climate change as well. But yeah, I would like to ask about the legal perspective. Do you believe that there should be a revision of the international law on with regards to cultural heritage as climate change is accelerating? And if yes, like to what extent or how? And the second one, do you think, because you said like in terms of risk assessment that the conflict risk is quite low in the Arctic for now, but as climate change is accelerating with more actors being involved, there might be, should there be an increase on the risk assessment? Yeah, these are my two questions.
Thank you for your questions. For the first question related to revising international law, I think it would be very helpful if there was another annex or another revision to the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention that deals with states' obligations to mitigate climate change, but from explicitly for the purpose of protecting underwater cultural heritage. And this would require states to look in a more localized context, to look at states in terms of what kind of ships that they use, that they send their flag states out, and how that affects pollution and how this pollution affects the cultural heritage. And because right now it's that issue is covered in a separate convention dealing with ships pollution that just tells states to avoid these sites. But I think maybe the answer is, instead of avoiding these sites, just don't really pollute as much, or to find a better solution to it. So I think there is some adaptation that has to happen. I think in the Arctic there should be a much more specific regime that deals with how sensitive the ice is in the Arctic. So very briefly on the second question about geopolitics in the Arctic, I think I will also defer to some experts on security, but related to this. But briefly, I think it is possible that there may be more conflict related in the Arctic once it opens up a bit, but I don't necessarily think that this conflict will be military. So I think that we saw recently with Russia increasing its military activities in the Arctic, and I think that was largely just a show of force. This happens basically every year where Russia does this. Almost by schedule, you can like look at your calendar and be like, oh, this is almost the week where this is going to happen. So I don't think it's that big of an issue so far, but it is, like I think something you said, just to keep your eyes up on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. We have one final question that I missed from Maddie, who wants to know what happens when the wreck is a gravesite, and can the wreck be explored and salvaged, or are you required to leave it in place?
Yeah, generally the deceased is not exhumed, so they're not removed from the ocean. Normally there would, but if they are removed, there is normally like a plaque there that you can go visit and see. And I think the distinction as to which bodies are removed and which are not is, in theory, it should be that all bodies are left in the ocean. And this is based on a very long history of sailors' graves, but the bodies that are removed are what states deem as nationally important, and they want to do more research on it. So I think it's a lot more political in terms of distinguishing what is removed and what is not removed. But I think it's a lot more of a matter of custom to leave the bodies there.
Thank you for that final answer. And if everyone could join me again in giving a huge round of applause. Thank you so much, Emily, for being so generous with your time today and your expertise in a really thoughtful and comprehensive presentation. There was so much packed into this first hour, and I'm so thankful that we all got to learn from you today. Thank
you so much for having me here.
Yeah. So we are going to switch gears now. So we are moving from cultural heritage to still cultural heritage, but really looking at biodiversity conservation. And it is my honor to introduce another colleague and friend, Victoria Buschman, who almost Dr. Victoria Buschman, very, very close, who is an Inupiat wildlife and conservation biologist. And she is currently zooming in from Greenland, but has worked really across the Arctic in an effort to promote how Indigenous peoples fundamentally shape Arctic biodiversity conservation. And that includes research, management, but also actualizing the dreams of new protected areas. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Victoria. You can give a bit more of an introduction of yourself, but I am so excited that you are joining us today.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm really sorry that I couldn't join before. I was in another meeting, and Emily, I would have loved to see your presentation, so I'm a little bit bummed. So thank you for the introduction, Victoria. That was really nice. I am a wildlife and conservation biologist. I'm finally finishing my PhD after 6 very long years. So today what I'm going to be presenting a little bit is some of that research, but it's not going to be, that particular presentation. I think it's going to be a little bit more enjoyable than what I'm going to do next week. So we can just jump right in if we want. Like Victoria had said, I'm an Inupiat woman, Indigenous scholar. I'm originally from Northern Alaska, from a community called Ukavik, but I live now here in Greenland. Something that a lot of people don't actually know is that our peoples, Inuit, span from Russia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and we actually speak dialects of the same language. And so I'm actually not that far from home for being so far away from home. Today we're going to talk mostly about sort of conservation biology as a discipline, sort of the ways that conservation biology has evolved over the years. We're going to talk about why now is the time that Indigenous communities are being asked to be more involved in conservation efforts, why so many more Indigenous-led conservation efforts are popping up all across the Arctic, and sort of the direction that we want to go as peoples to help further Indigenous rights and sort of global conservation goals as we move forward. So to begin with, the Arctic as we know it is sort of these kinds of landscapes, right? They're big, they're majestic, they're beautiful, they're almost ethereal and otherworldly. You know, that's why a lot of people get involved in Arctic research, is because it's just phenomenal being in some of these environments. One thing that I struggle with in sort of our narrative around the Arctic is that we often talk about the Arctic as being sort of remote and empty and sort of distant and, you know, beyond the focus of human beings. But the truth of the matter is that the Arctic is extremely well populated. There are 4 million people living in the Arctic, sort of dependent on how you decide to cut that boundary, right? And 1 million of these people are Indigenous. And this is actually an underrepresented number, because many Indigenous peoples in Russia are actually not counted as part of this statistic. So there's actually a significant population of Indigenous peoples already here in the Arctic. And almost every corner of the Arctic has Indigenous presence. And what I mean is that you might look on a map and see that there are, you know, only a few settlements in this country, you know, only 60 here, only 50 there. But the truth is there are only a couple of places in the Arctic that Indigenous peoples don't live. And this includes Svalbard, which is an island north of Norway, northeast Greenland, which is just a giant ice sheet, and some of the islands that are north of Russia historically have not necessarily had Indigenous presence before. But even as we talk about these specific areas where Indigenous peoples are not living, we need to recognize that biodiversity that Indigenous peoples rely on are supported by these spaces. So there is no part of the Arctic that is irrelevant to Indigenous peoples. And it's not even dependent on sort of what the discipline is, right? So you could be a very technical natural resource scientist working on ice flows in the North Pole and might think that your work is not relevant to Indigenous communities, but the truth of the matter is that it is. No matter what your discipline is, it is likely that your work is of interest to Indigenous peoples. So why does any of this matter, right? Why is conservation focusing on Indigenous peoples in the Arctic or anywhere else? Well, there was a really good report that was released in 2019, the IPBES report, that talks about the significance of Indigenous peoples in sort of achieving our global conservation targets and goals over the next few decades. 25% of all land on Earth is owned, managed, used, or occupied by Indigenous peoples. This is a significant number. One quarter of the entire globe. And this land intersects or encompasses 35% of all protected areas in the world. This is also significant because we will come to a part of this presentation where I talk about how Indigenous communities don't necessarily have any decision-making power in those processes. And the last is that 35% of these lands, of that 25%, are also the lands that are experiencing the lowest human impact. So these are lands that are considered sort of pristine by those kinds of standards, of course, not meaning without human influence, just that these are the most biodiverse and healthy of our ecosystems. So as we talk about sort of achieving our global conservation targets and goals, such as those under Aichi Target 11, we can't do it without Indigenous peoples. If we're going to set aside an entire portion of this planet for conservation for protected areas, it's impossible to have these discussions without Indigenous peoples. So here's a little map of what Indigenous homelands in the Arctic look like, and this map is not entirely correct. So there's actually more lands here that are occupied than actually show on the map. But you can see that there is a significant number of Indigenous groups all across the Arctic. We have mostly Inuit here in Northeast Russia, through Alaska, Northern Canada, and Greenland. A lot of these portions actually in Northern Canada and Greenland should be covered because people are frequently in these areas, but there are not actual physical settlements there, right? People don't live there year round. Then we have Indigenous peoples of Russia, which are extremely diverse. We have the Sami people, reindeer herders from sort of Northern Europe who span Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And we have Iceland, which is sort of a special place because Icelanders are not Indigenous, but they are first settlers, and they have a lot of similarities with other Indigenous groups, which is why they are often included in maps like these. Oh, that's the wrong button. So like I was saying, the Arctic is actually very, very well traversed. This is a map actually that had come up at one of the winter college presentations. This is specifically of Canada, and unfortunately we don't have this kind of information from any of the other countries. But what this is ultimately showing is that there are very few places in the Arctic where people are not commonly traveling. These are modern, common routes between different regions. It might only be a few people a year who are traveling this way, but part of the reason that so much of the Arctic has, you know, Indigenous place names and Indigenous languages is because almost all of the land is used. And I do actually know some folks who have been up in these islands that seem to have nobody around there. I know a few people who have been up there by motorboat and things like that. So even this is a little bit underrepresented, but it does give you an idea that really Indigenous communities are very involved in the landscape. And one of the reasons that this is so important is because Indigenous knowledge, which is so connected to place, is a significant contributor to information when it comes to conservation. Because conservation is sort of a crisis-based discipline and we're operating the Arctic, which is very data deficient in many ways, Indigenous knowledge really helps us fill in those gaps and also identify when science is incorrect. So we need to also take into consideration that, you know, all across the Arctic, there is information out there that is relevant to various different scientific disciplines. And it is very both place-based and landscape scale. So something that I've been working on over the last few years, So I'm a conservation biologist, right? But that's sort of, it's neither fully natural science nor fully social science. It also incorporates a lot of policy. So it is a very interesting space where I do a lot of work that is both very much in very much encompasses and attuned to ecology and wildlife science and population dynamics, but also incorporates this element of management, and management comes with the necessary like social processes that are involved in management. Like, do people feel that the management regulations are effective, that they are worth following? These kinds of things also are a part of conservation biology. And of course, policy, because we're often creating laws and policies that help us achieve sort of our conservation targets and goals that are influenced by that science. But essentially, over the last 100 years, conservation biology has changed significantly. It used to be very much the domain of the natural sciences, and what I mean by this is that it was very technocratic. Human beings were not a consideration. It was mostly about setting aside protected areas that sort of encompassed resources that we might need in the future. This is especially true in the US. Conservation in Europe was a lot about protecting the last of the old growth forests. You know, some 70 to 100 years ago, this was the primary focus, protected areas in relation to natural resources that we might need one day. But over the years, it also began to encompass conservation of wildlife, because we became more interested in the 70s with the environmental movement of different species, particularly marine species, and the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We started to talk a lot more about wildlife and not just about protected areas. What we were finding, though, is that no matter what we sort of decided from the scientific technocrat side, it didn't necessarily make a difference, nor was it receiving the funding that it needed within government channels, right? So science doesn't necessarily inform policy. And so we started talking about the social and institutional dimensions. What does it mean to move science into policy? How do we get people to support our initiatives? How do we get them to understand that these initiatives are important? How do we get people to fund these initiatives in governments? So we really decided to step away from that purely scientific side of conservation because it just wasn't working. Then about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, so it's very recent, we started talking about conservation as a social process. So that means no matter what kind of science we're coming up with, if that science isn't relevant to society, or people don't feel that it's relevant to society, then we can't do anything, you know, productive. So we needed to approach conservation with an understanding for people and how people make decisions, because quite often we were finding that science was not the limiting factor, it was the decisions that people were making. Then about 10 years ago, we started talking about stakeholder-driven conservation. Now, stakeholder-driven conservation means that the people who are impacted by those decisions should have a say in what is implemented. What is still not talked about today is the difference between stakeholder-driven conservation and rights holder-driven conservation. Now, the reason that rights holder-driven conservation is important is because in the Arctic, Indigenous peoples are actually rights holders, not stakeholders. This is something that has been largely lost, I think, in a lot of the discussions around conservation. Under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, under Indigenous communities in the Arctic and in other parts of the world actually have a right to these decision-making processes, which puts many of these communities slightly one step above stakeholders, that things cannot happen without Indigenous communities. And as we begin to assert more of this Indigenous rights aspect to biodiversity and conservation, this is becoming stronger and stronger as a part of the conservation planning process. And then about 5 years ago, now maybe that's a little too short, maybe 7 years ago, we started talking about the human dimensions of conservation. And this mostly means that, you know, not only is talking about biodiversity, it's also about economics, it's about politics, it's about social justice, it's about a lot of different other human relevant topics. And so that we no longer can separate conservation and biodiversity from people. Like, this line has been entirely dissolved. Now, what I argue is that we're actually coming into a very unique period just in the last few years where there's been a focus on decolonizing conservation. And this means that we are no longer taking very Western approaches to conservation solely. Of course, these kinds of conservation efforts are still present all over the world, but Indigenous communities are becoming much greater drivers of conservation than ever before. And this is in part due to recognition of those rights within the global sphere. This means that a lot of Indigenous communities, including here in the Arctic, are directly responsible for requesting that protected areas are developed, for requesting more adaptive management strategies that are actually beneficial to populations rather than sort of just a bureaucratic sort of decision-making process. So this is very significant, and Indigenous communities, as we talked about just a few slides ago, that because we occupy so much of the landscape, this is really the only direction forward, is ensuring that as we continue to develop conservation, we do it in ways that are ethically conscious, culturally relevant, and fully knowledge-based. And another reason that this is important is because the conversations that we're having now, not only in conservation, but in all Arctic research disciplines around partnering knowledge systems. So how do we partner science with Indigenous knowledge in recognition that, at least in the Arctic, we are still very data deficient. And what I mean by this is that we're still learning things about basic biology every year. For example, I was talking with an elder from Alaska whose friend is from the Inuvialuit settlement region, which is just on the Canadian side of Alaska. And one of his friends there was involved or got involved in some research after there had been a polar bear study. And I'll give you a little bit of background. In this study, a lot of researchers that were going up to the ISR, the Inuvialuit settlement region, they were observing polar bears coming onto the land from the sea ice and consuming large amounts of lichen and mosses. Now, the conclusion in this paper was that these polar bears were exhibiting starvation behavior. And the communities that are in the ISR knew this was not true. So one thing is the significance of our research, right? Because that kind of research is the kind of research that is turned into policy, that goes into management decisions, and that adversely affect Indigenous populations who still actively to this day hunt like polar bears in Canada, not only for cultural reasons, but also for safety reasons. Now, this friend of this person that I know in Alaska, he got his community together and they talked to the researchers, and they were able to show them that, in fact, when the polar bears are exhibiting this behavior, it's because those are only the female bears that are pregnant. The female bears that are pregnant come onto the land off the ice, and they consume large amounts of moss and lichen as a way to clear out their digestive tract before they go into denning when they give birth. And this was shown to be true, and they were able to study this a little bit further. And it is a very unique kind of biology in this particular region of the Arctic. Many other species, populations of polar bears have not shown this behavior. It's very unique to polar bear populations north of the ISR. But this is why Indigenous knowledge is so important to science, because one, science is not infallible, right? We can get things wrong. But the second is that our responsibility is to create science, or to do science that is as close to truth as possible, because when our science is translated into policy, that adversely or can adversely affect people who have to live with those decisions. So in order to be responsible about our science, we have a responsibility to also engage with Indigenous communities in the Arctic for a variety of things. Now, this diagram is showing a lot of different things, but essentially what I want you to focus on is that Indigenous knowledge and science are both strong at different things. And it's the partnership of these kinds of strengths, at least here, is about wildlife science, so specifically about studies that are in concerning sort of wildlife science, those kinds of field studies. Indigenous knowledge is providing a very different kind of information. And this information is possible to get through science, but it's extremely time consuming to do. It's very expensive. Trying to figure out historic ranges of species is, I've worked on a study like that before, going through bones and doing, DNA tests to try and figure out what a population looked like 400 years ago is really difficult. But Indigenous communities often have stories and information and knowledge that is captured in those stories that does actually date back even more than 1,000 years prior. And an example I can give you of that is that in Greenland, there has been a lot of talk about, over the years, about a different sort of non-human, I'm blanking on like the technical terms, I'm not an anthropologist, but there was another species of human that wasn't human here before. And it was a very big deal when they sort of were able to show that not only in the archaeological record, but through genetic testing. But actually Indigenous communities here, Inuit communities here in Greenland, had already known that these people existed. And these stories go back 1,000 years and they were known to be true, So this information has persisted over a long period of time. It wasn't that people came and discovered that there was another kind of peoples here. It was already known. They were, of course, able from the scientific process to put a date on it, but that information was still found in Indigenous knowledge. So there is a lot of reason for why we would even consider asking Indigenous communities, talking with Indigenous communities, learning from Indigenous communities in all kinds of Arctic research. Now we're going to transition a little bit to talking about protected areas all across the Arctic. I did a study for CAF, which is the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, the Biodiversity Working Group of the Arctic Council. I did some work for them for about 1.5 years, looking at protected areas in the Arctic, and it was called the Arctic Wetlands and Indigenous Peoples Study. Now, the reason this was relevant is because 60% of the Arctic is wetlands in one form or another, mostly defined by sort of a seasonal persistence of water on the landscape. So these ecosystems are often the most biodiverse ecosystems in the Arctic, other than sort of when we talk about different communities of phytoplankton and things in the ocean, and also of Arctic coral reefs. Arctic wetlands are extremely biodiverse relative to all other kinds of ecosystems in the Arctic. And this is important because between 1700 and 2000, we lost 85% of all wetlands globally, which is 3 times faster than forests, and it doesn't receive the kind of attention in scientific research that it really should. So we put together a study to look at Arctic protected areas all across the north that were in relation to Arctic wetlands, and also were in relation to Indigenous communities. So we selected 35 protected areas in all 8 Arctic countries, and there are 7 major Indigenous groups that are sort of represented in this study. So this is also one of the first circumpolar studies on protected areas that we've had yet. So essentially, we looked at all of this different kind of data that came from management plans, from conservation plans, these things called participation plans, which occur in some of the European countries. So it's a roadmap essentially of how a certain conservation effort or protected area intends to engage with the community over a long time span, so that when people turn over within an organization or in a government body, that those connections and objectives are not lost. Actually, surprisingly, we see this mostly in Russia, which is pretty cool. And then I spent a lot of time talking with the different management authorities who were responsible for sort of these protected areas. This included that a lot of these materials were not in English, so a lot of time was spent sitting with conservation and management plans in Finnish or in Norwegian, and they took a really long time to get through. But essentially what we were able to do with those documents is collect information in 7 different areas. So information that related to the different management authorities, who owned the land, who managed the land, sort of what was that structure within the government process, what were the management actions that were being taken, what were the conservation actions that were being taken, what kinds of species were there, what were those protections like, were they listed on the red list, which is the endangered species list for most countries that are outside of the US, what were the indigenous uses of these spaces, what was the participation like for Indigenous communities within these management efforts, and what were some of the listed environmental concerns. So we can't go through all of the data and things, that would just take too long, but I'll give you some of the big findings of this study. The first is that 82.9% of all of these surveyed protected areas supported Indigenous uses. And I don't mean from a legal standpoint, I mean biologically, 82.9% of these landscapes were being used by Indigenous communities. And this number is likely underreported because there were some management and conservation plans that don't reference Indigenous peoples at all. But from talking with management authorities, with different community members, we could identify that in fact, almost all of these areas were being used by Indigenous communities, and for a variety of different subsistence activities. So a subsistence activity is sort of an activity that is traditional in nature, but also is contributing to sort of food security or some kind of other sort of cultural use. So there's a little bit of farming in Scandinavia, a lot of herding, mostly in Scandinavia and Russia. Gathering was pretty similar all across the region, and then fishing and hunting were the most popular. And this includes in some of the protected areas. So it wasn't just hunting of terrestrial species, but also of freshwater species and of marine species. When we come to land ownership, it's interesting to find that most of these protected areas are functionally owned by state. This doesn't mean state like in the US context, it's like the federal government, the state government, the big government. And some of it was owned a little bit more by regional governments, which we would call sort of the state governments in the states. But what's interesting is only 25% of all of these protected areas were owned either fully or in part by Indigenous communities. And this is primarily in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. The other is that when it comes to management authority, Indigenous communities are only asked to be a part of the decision-making process for these protected areas in 34.2% of these spaces. So if we contrast that to what we just saw, that most of these protected areas are in use by Indigenous communities, but the majority of Indigenous communities don't have a say in how those protected areas are managed. We're seeing a gap here, right? And additionally, some things that came out of the management plans is that most of the management plans, most of the conservation plans fail to acknowledge Indigenous presence at all. So conservation still being treated as a thing that is separated from human beings. We're not seeing sort of a representation or acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples within these management processes. The lack of information on Indigenous uses, so what are people consuming? What are people hunting? What is the significance of that? Is it for food security purposes? Is it, to what degree is the reliance? We just don't know these things. And this doesn't mean that, knowing these things is going to help us better control these communities. What it means is that if we can acknowledge that Indigenous communities are using certain resources in certain places, then we're not unnecessarily inhibiting those activities from occurring. And improving this documentation just helps us make decisions that respect and accommodate these uses. So we don't even know what communities are relying on in their areas because management and conservation plans are not interested in documenting these things. So as we sort of, we just looked at what it is like, there's a lot of discussions right now about where we should go. So what kind of future we can imagine for conservation. And this is something that I've been working on for the last 6 years. I've spoken with communities all over the Arctic, lots of different, not just Indigenous peoples, but also local peoples in Northern Scandinavia and other places, conservation professionals, academics. A lot of those perspectives have also been incorporated into this next little bit of information. Essentially, we're at a point where we have decided that conservation in the Arctic needs to be 3 things: ethically conscious, culturally relevant, and fully knowledge-based. What this means is that conservation needs to adhere to the rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. needs to be culturally relevant, which means that we can no longer just create conservation measures and expect that communities can accommodate that. If we have communities that are reliant on hunting some marine species that is protected by a particular country, we need to find a way around that to accommodate that, while also, of course, supporting healthy endemic populations for different species. It also needs to be fully knowledge-based. And what we mean by this is that it's no longer enough to just use science to make these kinds of decisions. We also need to be partnering with Indigenous knowledge to ensure that our conservation efforts are being effective the way that we want them to be effective. So within this sort of framework, we're thinking about conservation as sort of encompassing many different activities that need to occur in order for us to achieve these three things. So this is sort of what I'm calling co-productive conservation. So we talk a lot about the co-production of knowledge, but now we're going to talk about the co-production of conservation. There are 6 things that we need to be sure that we're doing. We need to be planning together from the very beginning. What are the objectives and goals of a particular conservation initiative? Is it the development of a protected area? Is it the development of a new co-management strategy? Indigenous communities need to be at the table from the very beginning of the discussion. We need to co-prioritize together. We have lots of resources, and there's many different ways that these could be either parsed out or protected through different management mechanisms, such as, bag takes, how many can you take, how many species can you, how many individuals can you hunt in a particular trip? What are the hunting seasons? How many can you take in a whole year? There are lots of different management mechanisms. So what are our priorities for a particular space? We need to learn together. So co-learning, this is sort of that place where we sit down and build a shared evidence base. We need not only the scientific information, but we need the Indigenous knowledge in order to sit down and ensure that we have all of the information that we need to begin to structure sort of a management strategy. And then we do need to actively manage together. So this is not just, sitting back and watching it all unfold. This is also, of course, adaptive management. So we need to be continually assessing and reassessing whether our management efforts make sense, whether they're helping us achieve the goals that we've set forth or not, those kinds of things. Then we need to co-deliver. Now, this one sounds a little bit vague, but what this essentially is the enforcement of conservation efforts. Both like legally and within social systems. It's also research. This is a delivery. And it's also sort of education for not only the communities and researchers and others involved in a particular initiative, but also publicly, more broadly for society. And then we need to be also assessing together. So this is not like a step-by-step process, right? These 6 things are constantly occurring and need attention consistently, because conservation efforts no longer can afford to be stagnant. We're working in an environment in the Arctic that is rapidly changing. This is what everybody says, right? But we no longer can have management strategies, conservation strategies that are stagnant. We need to have constant attention to them to ensure that as populations change, as ecosystems change and shift, we need to be attentive to the goals of our conservation efforts. Now, we don't really have time for this, but here's a very big, scary looking diagram that details more specifically what some of these things are. You can see in the center that the conservation lens is ethically conscious, culturally relevant, and fully knowledge-based. It includes these 6 activities. And then as we go into the outer rings, it's getting more and more descriptive about what that might actually mean, to the point where we see things like taking project ownership is like a part of conservation, that establishing access and availability to resources is a part of conservation, and assessing external transformation, which is, did the work that we did actually contribute to anything meaningful going forward? Was it adopted into policy? Has it been adopted into sort of a state or Arctic level initiative? So these are all kinds of things that we need to attend to if we want conservation to make sense. And then I'm going to leave you with this last thing. There are 7 things that this sort of approach to conservation does that are important. So one is that it increases collaboration between Indigenous communities and researchers, which has been generally acknowledged to be not very productive in the past. So connecting science to people a little bit more, co-productive conservation, this kind of conservation effort helps us achieve that. It also ensures that our efforts are stakeholder driven or rights holder driven so that we can get the buy-in of the people who we need to be invested in our projects. We need to also supply this time critical information, and this co-learning sort of partnership between science and Indigenous knowledge helps us identify that time critical information. It also fosters co-management, which across the Arctic is not necessarily supported. So as we move forward and we show that co-management strategies are actually beneficial not only to biodiversity, but also to Indigenous communities, it makes these kinds of processes more appealing. Additionally, these kinds of conservation initiatives that adhere to these things help improve not only biodiversity, but culture. So if Indigenous communities can continue to engage in subsistence activities, in other cultural activities, we're also working towards the healing of Indigenous communities, not just to the healing of biodiversity. So we get this sort of twin achievement. The 6th is that we're looking at finding conservation strategies that are both place-based and landscape scale. So the reason that this approach to conservation helps us do that is because Indigenous knowledge really brings us to the place. So how does a certain management strategy need to be applied here, but also with attention to the landscape scale? So how do all of these sort of management strategies fit together to help us achieve those goals at the global level? And lastly, it helps us how we evaluate and apply conservation initiatives. So are they really doing what we need them to do? Are we really sort of supporting biodiversity conservation if we're only focusing on one species when the alternative is to focus on many species and build a more robust set of biodiversity within an ecosystem? These kinds of questions are becoming more common as we approach conservation in this way because we're getting more perspectives. And lastly, these are some folks that I've worked with who have lovely faces, and I've been very grateful for their help and whatnot in the last 6 years. And I know that this has been very fast, but this is where I'm leaving you for questions, just so that we have a little bit of extra time. And thank you to everyone who has ever supported me ever, because I would have achieved nothing without them. But yeah, that was my very, very fast take on conservation and biodiversity in the Arctic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if everyone could join in giving, I already see people are applauding without me even asking for applause, because while that was quick, you covered everything. It was an amazing presentation. So well done. And you covered a lot, but the slides and your descriptions of them were so straightforward and really made it accessible. So I really appreciate that, as someone who is not a natural scientist, that you were able to help me access that knowledge. We already have many questions that have come in. Our first question comes from Suzanne, who I am going to ask to come on so she can ask her question.
Thanks so much, Victoria, and thanks so much, Victoria, as well, for your presentation. I work in the space of co-management, focusing on public participation. So much of what you said was really, really relevant and interesting for me. One of the struggles that I've had, and the big question that I have, and why I'm so excited to hear about a point in your presentation where you talked about the evolution of conservation biology. And right at the end, you said, you know, in the last 5 years or so, you really see that there's a decolonial movement or moment in conservation biology. And you describe conservation biology as a crisis-based discipline and a data-deficient discipline, which makes perfect sense in the context of what you describe it later on in partnering knowledge systems. So the question that I have, and I have 2 questions here, is that In my fieldwork, I've seen government biologists, and they're not conservation biologists, but that is how they have been trained. And they apply a conservation lens to their work in government biology, which is not necessarily focused on conservation per se. But that is the lens with which they apply. And I've seen a number of times where this lens doesn't quite work for the communities in which they are placed in. But at the same time, it's not in the job description that I understand that a regional government biologist has to apply a decolonial lens, despite the fact that they are placed in these communities for years. In many cases, communities don't have a say on what kind of biologist is hired or who is actually hired. So it's what I've heard is that it's very much hit or miss. Sometimes they get lucky, sometimes they don't. So I would love to hear more about this decolonial movement in conservation biology. Is that something that the discipline as a whole is embracing? Are there lots of people who are resistant to it? Who are the main architects of this decolonial movement? I'd just love to find out more. And then my second question is, you talked about participation and public participation in decision making is something that I'm kind of focusing on, that very little piece to understand. Well, how is Indigenous voice being heard when we talk environmental decision making using public participation? So I was curious whether in your experience being part or observing these kinds of decision making processes, what have you seen when it comes to public participation? Is Indigenous voice heard, or how does your lens apply or your framework apply to public participation?
Yeah, those are really great questions. Thanks. All right, I'm going to try and remember to get to all of them, to all the bits. But you're totally right about sort of this trajectory of conservation. It's been very, very recent. It has actually originally come from many of the Indigenous communities, and this is actually especially true in Australia and Canada. This is sort of where these sort of decolonized approaches, these Indigenous-led approaches, have been most strongly developed. And this has a lot to do with sort of the particular Indigenous context within both of those countries. So it's a little bit, it arose a little bit out of sort of those political sort of institutional structures that exist. So in Canada, because of the land claims agreements and the way that they've been structured over the last, 30 years, there have been slow gains in sort of, especially and particularly Inuit rights in Canada. Of course, there are, the difference between, in Canada, at least between Inuit and all other First Nations peoples. But at least a lot of Inuit have been able to assert their rights in their agreements with Canada that do ensure that, they have a right to their species, they have a right to their lands and waters. And one of the ways that Canadian Inuit have approached their sovereignty is through conservation. Conservation has become a mechanism for asserting that right to hunt, asserting that right to have control over, mineral extraction and shipping, the opening of the Northwest Passage to shipping. All of these things are sort of conveniently put and placed into a conservation lens because it works very well for Canada. So generally speaking, in the Arctic, Canada is upheld as like, this is the place where the most work is being done right now. This is where the most possibilities are. But of course, Canada has its own struggles as well, which includes that amongst the Indigenous populations, with the exclusion of Russia, Canadian Indigenous populations have been the most excluded from education. So you do have less professionals in higher degree programs who, I'm not saying, have a better understanding of how to manage these resources at all. What I'm saying is that from a global perspective, from a state perspective, people sort of assign value to that higher education, right? You have legitimacy if you can prove that you have been a part of our Western system, that you understand these things. And so in Canada, the struggle is that there aren't very many people who are educated in this way. But because conservation has become this mechanism for asserting Indigenous sovereignty, there are programs where there are like Indigenous guardian programs, stewardship programs, Indigenous manager programs. So training communities to be the managers in these locations has become strongly asserted, at least in the last few years, and especially with the establishment of Taliritiapamanga, which is the Lancaster Sound National Marine Conservation Area in the Northwest Passage in 2019. That also came with 54 million CAD in benefits to Indigenous communities. So this is being asserted, like conservation from an Indigenous perspective is being asserted in Canada as a way to take control of the land, for Indigenous communities to take control of the lands and waters and have more decision-making power. This is not the same. Obviously, the political structures are very different in Alaska. In Greenland here, 90% of the population is Inuit, might not identify as Indigenous, but we have our own government. But it's also true that our government exists within the structure of Denmark. So there are other forces at play there, and conservation is not particularly talked about or desirable from a Greenlandic perspective, just because, a lot of the land here is not under threat from a lot of the same things that are going on in Canada. There hasn't been a need to approach conservation in that perspective. That's some of the background on that. So in Canada, we just don't have people who have grown up in the North, who have been educated in the North, who have even been educated as conservation biologists. These are programs that are mostly taught in the US and the UK and not in other countries. So you have more lab biologists or field biologists who don't necessarily have sort of this management conservation background that just go to do their science. And that's where you miss sort of the human aspect of things that people would benefit from. The other thing that you asked is Indigenous participation in general. One thing that I find a lot of people talk about is that consultation is something that sort of has a legal mechanism in a lot of Arctic states, but consultation is not like the epitome of participation, right? That's not even participation. That's being informed about a decision that has already been made. That's generally what consultation looks like. A lot of Indigenous communities that I've worked with have talked about how there is, well, I've categorized it kind of as a spectrum where we have sort of consultation, and then there's like knowledge sharing, and then there's, asking for information that's different. There's co-management, and then there's co-production, right? So there's like this whole spectrum of how involved Indigenous peoples can be within an effort. And often we find that conservation is still focusing on this consultation, sort of informing the community, sort of one-way perspective where they're feeding information, but not necessarily taking feedback or things like that. That's still very common. But again, we're seeing a lot of Indigenous communities assert their rights all the way on this side of the spectrum, where they're saying, no, we need to be involved in this process from the beginning. If you want to meet your obligations under the United Nations, like this is the way that you need to do it. And there has been a lot of success in approaching it from this way. I hope that answers some of that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was incredibly comprehensive. We have 3 more questions that have come in. Scout, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Victoria, for a great presentation. My question, I think, might be related to Suzanne's question, but you mentioned that co-management strategies haven't been accepted by everyone in the Arctic. And I was wondering, in which areas are you receiving the most pushback on your research and participation, and from who?
That one is, it's a really good question, because it's not necessarily who we think about would be the answer. In many places in Russia, there's a lot of pushback. There is no formal co-management sort of structure in Russia, but for Indigenous communities in Northeast, and especially far Northeast Russia, there is a lot more flexibility there. Greenland does not support co-management at all, despite being sort of a Scandinavian country. But that's the other thing, sort of the champions of co-management so far in the Arctic have been Canada and the United States. The ones that fail, I shouldn't say fail, that still struggle with this as not only a concept, but how to do it functionally are the Scandinavian countries. So I was recently speaking with some of my Sami friends in a panel, and we were talking about sort of the Scandinavian countries are often upheld as these champions of human rights and of equality and high standards of living. But the truth is, a lot of Sami feel like this is not the case for them because their rights have not been, even in Finland, formally recognized at all by the government. So they still have a lot of difficulty with reindeer co-management strategies. Sweden does a little bit better than Norway and Finland, but because of sort of European race politics, there are more limitations to those kinds of discussions than there are in Canada and the US. And Greenland, because it is owned by Denmark, is a little bit more of that flavor, but also it's complicated by the fact that, like I said, 90% of the population is Inuit. So there is a feeling that our government is already our own. So that's just a slightly different feel. But even with that, there are many co-management strategies that I know of in Alaska that don't function at the full capacity that, you know, they were intended to function or that they had hoped would function, simply because, like Suzanne had said, there are people within these processes who are hesitant or resistant to these kinds of changes because they do step away from this very technocratic kind of side that especially people who were educated in these fields 40, 50 years ago don't feel are acceptable. But that's just sort of change in general, right? We're moving towards something really, really new, and there's always going to be some pushback.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we will try to get through these two final questions. Dimitris, do you want to come on and ask yours?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And yeah, I can say I relate to a lot of this part of the policy-making process with my studies. You have on the one hand, the modeling and simulation of the scientific and technological aspects. And you have the public participation, which is on one hand, in this case, the indigenous communities. I was actually interested in the co-learning process. So what are the tools that are being used, and is there some sort of capacity building? And the second question is related to the capacity building, basically, would you think that it would be important to involve in like also additionally to capacity building in scientific terms, also some capacity building in terms of like how to form policies, how to participate in the decision making efficiently in order to, for example, turn the situation towards what would you want, based of course on like the knowledge that you have on the topic. So yeah, like capacity building and policy making in general.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, thanks. I'll get to both of those. Co-learning is really unique. It's also sort of the process that the most people are interested in and want answers to, but there isn't a lot of resources for it, right? I think it's difficult to say what a co-learning process needs to have because it's very dependent on what kinds of things we're working on. But there are two, I think, really important pieces of advice. The first is that we might think that we need to focus on teaching others sort of the scientific side of things, the lingo, those kinds of things. But what I find in the initiatives that I've been involved in is that it's actually the opposite, that sort of we can only approach co-learning in a productive way if Indigenous knowledge is valued and respected. So a lot of it is actually teaching scientists that, you know, there is another way to approach the world. There are, you know, other validation processes. There are other sort of Indigenous methodologies for research that, you know, are not necessarily recorded, but they're legitimate. And really what a lot of scientists need, I think, in this part of it is to sit down with folks and let Indigenous community members, knowledge holders, sort of show how their knowledge is applicable. Because I think a lot of scientists have never, you know, had to sit down and think about things in a different way. But it becomes much more clear what Indigenous knowledge is, what is it not, how is it useful, when those knowledge holders are allowed to show that application. And that can be in things like mapping activities have been really productive in this space. So like Indigenous community members are very good at identifying particular places and different population dynamics over, spatial and temporal scales. Mapping is one of the places where I think it's most visually apparent that Indigenous knowledge has application for science. And of course, because you can include science and mapping, in any kind of geospatial capacity, then you can see them side by side and that they're very mutually beneficial. It is true that most Indigenous community members, or many Indigenous community members, don't have that same high level of science sort of education. Part of this is also learning how to communicate those scientific processes without all of this jargon, like without all of this language, because people ultimately understand these environmental and physical processes. They don't necessarily have names or, those kinds of things. And so really this co-learning activity is best done actually just sitting at a table with folks and discussing different, kinds of knowledge, different observations that people have had. That's really, really helpful. Capacity building and policymaking is also really interesting because this is very true, but again, I would turn it on its head that what we need often is policymakers to come and see what we're doing and how we're managing. Land managers need to come and see how Indigenous communities are already managing, because a lot of Indigenous communities are managing beyond sort of legal scope, beyond sort of those kinds of things. There are already management practices that have been in place for, thousands of years that people still adhere to. But they've never obviously been recorded or written down or acknowledged as real management efforts. I would also say that generally speaking, Indigenous communities are quite aware, or at least the folks who are involved in these kinds of things are quite aware of the policy processes within their own context, because if they ever want to get anything done, they already have to know, they have to be experts sort of in this process to get things to move forward. So it's also about sort of educating policymakers and land managers and those kinds of things in how things are already going on. But thanks for your question. That was really good.
Thank you. We have one more question, and I know we're over time. So I think the final, we have two more questions. Okay. One question is from Sierra, who asks, are there occasional contradictions among Indigenous knowledge and Western science? And are there disconnections even within the same or close Indigenous communities?
This is a really good question. We get this one all the time. There is definitely some contradictions between Indigenous knowledge and science. They're in very specific things. So it's pretty easy to give, okay, this is something that we're not totally sure about. We're going to give this some attention and review. One thing that I think is dangerous is that a lot of times scientists want to validate the findings of Indigenous knowledge, and this is not how this works. If you can't understand the way that the knowledge is accumulated and processed, then it's very difficult to validate it. So we talk about Indigenous knowledge needing to be allowed to validate itself. So if there is any kind of mismatch in scientific and Indigenous knowledge, then those community members need to get together and discuss, how are they going to sort of, I want to say ramify, that is not a word. Mediate, that's not the word either. How they're going to approach that issue that they have in their knowledge. Sometimes Indigenous knowledge is used to validate the findings of scientific knowledge, but this is only because in scientific knowledge, we do certain kinds of sampling methodologies that don't necessarily, like if you're not sampling in the right place, no amount of sampling is ever going to get you close to the number that you're looking for. So that has been used that way, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that Indigenous knowledge needs to be allowed to validate itself. I feel like I'm missing something.
I think that was very a very thoughtful answer.
Okay.
All right, we have one follow-up question from Suzanne, and that will finish out our session today.
Thank you so much. Victoria, if I can ask for your indulgence, you talked about rights holders, which I was wanting to follow up on. And you mentioned that Indigenous communities are now recognized as stakeholders, but not rights holders. And rights holders would be, an increased level of standing in decision-making processes. Could you talk a little bit more about how this narrative of Indigenous peoples as rights holders versus stakeholders, how that is unfolding, and sort of the ramifications of that?
Yeah, definitely. So this is something that has really been pushed for in Canada. This is where the most discussions about rights holders are occurring. It is tricky because, we're in a world where, equality is very important, but we're not necessarily talking about equity. And equity, in my mind, is a little bit more important than just basic equality. Now, when it comes to equity, and especially under laws and treaties that have been signed with Indigenous communities and their respective countries, in recognition that often Indigenous communities are actually treated as foreign nations, technically from a legal standpoint within their own countries. And this is true also in Alaska and Canada. Rights holders are they're a step up here, right? That means that, I have more than a stake in this process, and everybody else, especially as we talk about public lands in the US and Canada, a lot of people don't understand why this is okay, why it's okay to value rights holders above stakeholders, because we're supposed to be all on sort of an equal playing field. This one is very tricky because, something that I have to remind people in my work is that most public lands are stolen lands, and that there were rights and obligations that were written into those original treaties. Those treaties were broken. Federal governments often have a responsibility to their Indigenous communities now because of sort of the errors that occurred in the history of acknowledging those treaties and ensuring that those treaties were followed. And so most governments, or I shouldn't say most, some of the Arctic governments do have a responsibility to Indigenous peoples first and public second, especially when the public is, sitting in Florida and we're talking about a protected area in Alaska. Like, it's very different to have a stake in a particular place, and then to have your entire livelihood, culture, and last 5,000 years of history in a spot. This has not been recognized by some countries, particularly, Russia has some trouble with this. Finland is going through something right now. But for the most part, rights holders is where this conversation is going. But it is difficult to educate the public about why such sort of hierarchy, it might feel like a hierarchy exists, but it's because of legal rights and responsibilities that governments have to their people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think a lot to think about, and also to connect to the next few speakers that we have in our final 2 weeks. So if you could again join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Victoria, for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. I am so appreciative, and I see from everyone else's clapping and heart emojis that they are also appreciative of you being so generous with your expertise and research and knowledge today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I was really glad to be able to join you, and I wish I could just sit in for the whole semester.
It's I'm a little biased, but I think we have some pretty spectacular speakers. So this concludes our week 4. we are moving into week 5 next week, where we will be hearing from 2 amazing speakers, both from Russia. One will talk about Indigenous public health in Arctic Russia, and the second will talk about cultural diplomacy across Russia and Europe. So that will be very, very exciting. As a reminder, we can continue the conversation on our Slack channel or in our discussion session tomorrow. All right, that is all from me. I hope you all have a really wonderful